Under the low, patient lamps of London, there is a particular kind of quiet that only arrives when the city is wrapped in fog. It is not true silence. London never truly falls silent, but a softened hush, as if the streets themselves have agreed to speak in whispers. Wheels roll slower. Footsteps lose their edges. Even the river seems to breathe more carefully, drawing the night in and letting it out again in long, measured drafts. I had learned, over the years, to treat that hush with respect. Fog can be merciful in its way. It blurs the sharp corners of the day. It makes ordinary worries feel farther away, as though they belong to someone else, on another street, in another hour. Yet the same fog has a second nature, one that the city pretends not to notice. It hides what should be seen. It carries sounds to the wrong places. It makes a man believe he is alone when he is not. And in that softened, deceptive London, the case of the ledger began, not with a scream, not with a chase, not with any of the dramatic things the papers like to promise their readers, but with a small object lifted from the water at dawn. It was found near a narrow set of steps leading down to the Thames, where the stone was slick with night and the air tasted faintly of iron. A dock hand, half awake, collar turned up, breath smoking in the pale light, noticed something bumping gently against the edge. At first he thought it was a piece of broken crate or a discarded satchel. But when he reached down with his hook and drew it closer, he saw it was a book. A book bound in dark leather. Nothing about it should have been remarkable. The river takes what it wants and returns what it tires of: planks, bottles, umbrellas, the occasional hat. Yet this was no ordinary refuse. The man who found it would later tell me that the first unsettling thing was not the weight of it, nor the manner in which it drifted as if guided, but the condition of it. It was dry. Not merely less wet than expected, dry in the way an object is dry when it has been kept indoors, away from rain, away from mist, away from the river itself. The leather was not swollen. The pages did not cling. There was no tide mark, no smell of damp paper, no stain of silt at the edges. He opened it there on the steps, against every sensible instinct. The first page was written in a neat, economical hand, the kind used by men who count coins for a living and prefer the world to add up. A list of names. And beside each name, a date. Most were already past. Some only recently so. But one date sat there with a cold, quiet certainty that made the dockhand's throat tighten when he tried to speak it aloud. Today's date. He did not know the name beside it. He did not know why the sight of it made his skin prickle. He only knew, so he said, that he suddenly felt as though the fog had leaned closer, listening. By mid-morning the ledger had passed from rough hands to gloved ones, then into a constable's careful possession, and finally onto a desk where men with tired eyes and clean cuffs frowned over it as if frowning could force it to explain itself. By noon, a man whose name matched the one on the page failed to arrive at his work. By evening, his hat was found, neatly placed on a bench in a small public square, as though someone had removed it with courtesy and decided it ought not to be lost. Beside it lay a single coin, worn almost smooth, the sort you might find in a drawer of old things and wonder how long it had been there. No one could say where the man had gone. Not a single witness saw him leave. I had intended that day to write something harmless. A piece about the river trade. A report on the growing traffic of the city and the complaints that followed it like smoke. It was the sort of work that keeps a journalist fed but does not keep him awake at night. Instead, as the fog thickened again toward dusk, a note was delivered to my office, slipped under the door with a quiet confidence that suggested the sender knew precisely when the hallway would be empty. No stamp. No seal. Only my name, written in the same measured hand I had seen copied out in the constable's hurried description. Inside, the message contained one sentence. If you want the next name, ask Mr. Blackwood about a debt that cannot be paid. I read it twice before the meaning settled into place, slow and heavy. Then, in the strange way of such things, my mind supplied a detail I had not noticed at first. The paper was clean, almost too clean, untouched by soot or fingerprints, as if it had never been exposed to London's air. In that moment, I knew two things with a clarity that was nearly calming. First, this was not an accident. The ledger had not drifted in by chance. Someone wanted it found. Second, Edmund Blackwood was already part of it, whether he wished to be or not. I had made my acquaintance with Blackwood some years earlier, and while it would be easy, tempting even, to describe him as the sort of man legends gather around, that would not be entirely fair. Legends are loud. They announce themselves. They demand attention. Blackwood did not. He moved through a room as though he had no desire to disturb it, and yet the room always seemed to rearrange itself around him. Conversations lowered when he drew near. People found they were speaking more carefully, as if each word might be weighed later and found wanting. It was not intimidation, exactly. It was something colder and more precise. The sense that Edmund was listening for what you did not mean to say. That evening I walked to his address with the note in my pocket, the city's lamps smeared into soft halos by the fog. Carriages passed like ghosts of themselves. Somewhere a whistle sounded, distant, mournful, quickly swallowed. I remember thinking, as I turned down the last street, that the fog had grown thicker than it had any right to be. It did not merely obscure, it seemed to hold things. Sounds, ships, secrets. And I remember, too, the oddest thought of all, that the ledger was not a warning. It was an invitation. When Blackwood opened his door, he looked at me for only a moment before his gaze dropped to my hand, as if he could see the folded paper through my coat. His expression did not change, but the air around him seemed to sharpen, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Tell me," he said quietly, stepping back to let me in, "what has the river returned this time?" I crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind me with a gentle click. Outside, London breathed its fog into the night. Inside, Edmund Blackwood began to read the city the way he always did, not as streets and buildings, but as a ledger of invisible transactions. And somewhere in that ledger, a name waited for its date. Section 1. The book that should have been wet. I reached the river earlier than my habits preferred, yet later than the city's rumors had already begun to travel. London had wrapped itself in fog with uncommon patience, not in drifting scraps but in a steady, deliberate veil. The lamps along the embankment glowed like softened pearls, their halos smeared outward until the edges of the world seemed politely undecided. At the stone steps that led down toward the Thames, the air carried its familiar taste of iron and damp rope. The river was close, yet half concealed, breathing somewhere beyond the pale curtain. It returns what it wishes in its own time: planks, bottles, a hat with a crushed crown, usually swollen with water and stained with silt. That was why the first detail people could not stop repeating sounded almost childish in its bluntness. The ledger was dry. Not merely less wet than expected. Dry in the way an object is dry when it has sat indoors, away from rain, away from mist, away from the river itself. No tide mark along the edge. No pages clinging together. No sour smell of soaked paper. The very idea of it made men frown as if irritation might correct the world back into sense. By the time I arrived, the ledger had already moved through several hands. I did not see it lifted from the water. I saw what it left behind. Men spoke in lowered tones. A constable kept watch with the rigid attention of someone who dislikes being made to look uncertain. Curious faces hovered at a distance, close enough to stare, far enough to pretend they were only passing. The missing man's absence sat over everything like a second fog. He was a clerk, reliable, unremarkable, the sort of person whose life is made of punctuality and small routines. When such a man fails to appear, the disturbance is not dramatic, but structural, like a missing brick in a wall that has stood for years. People notice without wanting to, and they begin to rearrange their explanations to keep the wall from collapsing. I walked first to the small square where his hat had been found. It lay on a bench as though placed there with care, brim turned just so, the ribbon uncreased. Beside it, a single coin rested on the wood, dull and worn until its features were nearly smooth. Nothing about the arrangement suggested accident. It felt closer to punctuation, an ending mark in a sentence no one had been permitted to read. The papers would later give it color, as they always do. A river mystery, a vanishing in the fog. Yet standing there, I felt no thrill. Only that quiet unease that comes when the city behaves as if it is following instructions, and when even the fog seems less like weather and more like a witness holding its breath. My own access to the ledger arrived by means I would never boast of. A chain of small favors, a constable who owed me a kindness, a clerk who enjoyed being useful. What reached my desk was not the original book but a careful copy of several pages, written in a steady hand on clean paper. The sheets smelled faintly of ink and soap, as if the writer had washed before touching it, or washed afterward in the hope of leaving nothing behind. Even as a copy, the pages carried a peculiar weight, as if the act of copying had not softened the thing at all. The list was plain. Names, each spaced with a bookkeeper's neatness, and beside each name a date. No addresses. No notes. No flourishes. It had the calm of accounts, the kind of calm that suggests the writer believed the world could be made orderly if only everything were recorded correctly. Most of the dates were in the past. Some close enough to feel recent, others far enough back to belong to old columns and forgotten inquests. A few names stirred faint recognition, small tragedies that had been printed, discussed, and then folded into London's endless drawer of unfinished stories. One line, however, belonged unmistakably to the present. Today's date sat there with quiet certainty, and beside it the missing clerk's name. The simplicity of it was what unsettled me most. A life reduced to ink and a single day, as if the day itself were the event. The note delivered to my office had framed it differently, but the idea was the same. A debt that could not be paid. It was clever phrasing, because it suggested both magnitude and impossibility. Either the sum was too great for coin, or the debt was not measured in coin at all. I spent the afternoon walking routes that did not seem connected until I let the ledger's language guide me. I drifted past a shipping agent's office where men argued over manifests. I lingered near a pawnshop window where old coins lay in trays, their faces dulled by time. I watched a bookkeeper close his shutters with the precise motions of someone who prefers numbers to people. Everywhere, the fog smoothed sharp details into softness, and in that softness I began to see the same thing repeated, careful arrangement. Objects placed, not lost. Moments timed, not stumbled into. The coin on the bench became my first fixed point. It was not the kind used in ordinary trade. Its thickness and wear suggested age, and its very presence suggested intent. It felt less like payment and more like signature, a mark left by someone who did not wish to show his face. When evening returned me to my office, the fog pressed against the window panes as though trying to listen. I laid my notes beside the copied pages and read them again, slower this time, as if patience might reveal what haste had missed. The names remained names. The dates remained dates. Yet the page itself seemed composed, balanced, almost too tidy for a record of lives. It was then I noticed the alignment. The dates were positioned with unusual care, as though spacing mattered. Today's entries sat at a point that made the page feel level, like a scale set precisely to rest. I thought of the river steps, the hat, the coin, and felt the same conclusion returning with stubborn clarity. Someone was staging absences the way a man keeps accounts. I wrote that sentence in my notebook, not for publication, but because writing forces a thought to stand still long enough to be examined. Then I looked beneath today's line, and my stomach tightened. The ledger did not end with the present. Another name waited below, and beside it a date that belonged to tomorrow. Section 2. The name beneath today. A list that ends in the past can be filed away as a curiosity. A list that reaches into tomorrow refuses to be filed at all. It insists on living in the mind, like a clock that has begun to tick in a room where no clock should be. I kept returning to the line beneath today's entry. The ink was no darker than the rest, the hand no more hurried, and yet that single date, tomorrow, made the whole page feel less like a record and more like instructions. The name beside the date was unfamiliar to me, and that in itself was revealing. If this had been theater for the newspapers, the author would have chosen a figure whose absence would rattle the city loudly. Instead, the ledger preferred quieter stones, the kind that can be removed from a wall without anyone noticing until the draft comes through. By the time the lamp on my desk had burned low enough to leave a faint ring of soot on the glass, I had done what I always do when a story refuses to settle. I began to collect the ordinary facts that surround a man, because ordinary facts are the first things the extraordinary must pass through. The address came first. Not from the ledger, of course, which offered nothing so practical, but from a directory and a patient clerk who disliked being disturbed at closing. The name belonged to a man employed in a counting house not far from Fenchurch Street, an assistant, not a partner, a pen, not a signature. His lodging was in a narrow terrace where the bricks were the color of old tea and the windows were forever filmed with soot. Nothing about him suggested significance, which only deepened it. I walked his route in my mind before I walked it with my feet. It began, as most London mornings begin, with a door opened to grey air and a street that looked half-finished in the fog. A short climb toward the busier roads, a turn past a bakery that would already be warm, then the long, steady drift into the city where ledgers were kept and lives were measured in columns. Fog changes those routes. It shortens streets by hiding their ends. It lengthens them by forcing caution. It makes an alley seem like a shortcut and a trap at the same time. That was why the ledger's choice of tomorrow mattered. It was time enough for the city to shift its face, but not enough for a man to change his habits. Near midnight, I laid the copied pages away and went out, letting the cold air clear the ink scent from my head. The fog was thicker now, gathered at ankle height in slow-moving pools, and above it the lamps floated like pale moons. I did not go straight to the man's lodging. I went first to the river steps again, because every story has a point of origin, and I needed to see whether the place itself held anything I had missed. The stones were wet with night as they should have been. The river moved with its dark, patient confidence. Yet even there, even with the water at my feet, I could not shake the memory of that impossible dryness. On the landing above the steps, someone had been standing earlier, close enough to watch the recovery and far enough to remain unremarkable. I knew it because the soot on the railing had been disturbed in one narrow band, as if a gloved hand had rested there. The mark was faint, but it had purpose. It told me the ledger had not only been returned, it had been witnessed. From the embankment, I walked toward the square with the bench. The hat was gone now, taken as evidence, the coin as well, but the place still carried the afterimage of arrangement. People forget quickly in London, but would remember's pressure, and I could still see, in my mind, exactly where the brim had rested and where the dull metal had caught the light. When I reached my office again, there was nothing new waiting. No note under the door. Only the quiet persistence of the copied page and the awareness that dawn would come whether I was ready or not. I slept in fragments, the way one sleeps when the mind keeps checking the time without meaning to. Each time I woke, I pictured the ledger's tomorrow line as though it were written on the inside of my eyelids. At first light, I went to the terrace where the man lodged. The street was still dim, the fog turning every sound into a muffled suggestion. Curtains lay heavy behind the glass. A milk cart moved at a cautious pace. Nothing in the scene asked to be remembered. The door of the lodging house opened and closed several times as tenants left for their work. I watched their silhouettes pass into the gray. One man among them matched the description I had found, narrow-shouldered, careful in his movements, dressed in the sober way of someone who prefers not to be noticed. He carried no umbrella, though the air felt wet. He wore his hat firmly, as if it were part of his posture. I followed at a respectful distance, keeping the fog between us like a courtesy. His walk was steady, almost rhythmic. He did not pause to read a window. He did not stop to greet anyone. He moved with the small urgency of a man who has never missed a morning bell and has no intention of beginning now. 2 streets from the busier road, he slowed for the first time. The fog thickened ahead, pooling in a narrow passage between buildings. The passage was not closed, not dangerous in daylight, merely inconvenient. One of those lanes London offers when it wishes to tempt a man into saving a minute. He hesitated at the mouth of it, and in that hesitation I felt the ledger's hand. Not because he seemed afraid, but because the city around him seemed arranged to make the choice feel natural. A cart blocked part of the wider road. A cluster of workmen narrowed the pavement. The alley offered itself like an answer. He stepped in. The fog swallowed him almost at once. For a moment I could still see the pale suggestion of his hat, then even that dissolved. I reached the entrance quickly and paused just long enough to listen. There were footsteps, yes, but softened, misdirected, as if the sound had been folded and placed somewhere else. I smelled coal smoke and damp brick. I heard, faintly, the distant bell of a tram, and then nothing at all that I could trust. The alley ran through to another street. I emerged within half a minute, expecting to see him ahead, hat and shoulders moving on with their careful rhythm. The street beyond was open, its lamps still lit against the lingering gray. A woman swept her step. A boy ran past with a bundle of papers. There was no narrow-shouldered clerk, no sober hat, no steady walk continuing into the day. Only fog, thinning now, as if satisfied. And at the edge of the pavement, near the drain where rainwater gathered, a single coin lay on its side, dull, worn, and placed as neatly as punctuation. Section 3. The Mark in the Metal. London will forgive tragedy more easily than it will forgive the feeling of being managed. A street can accept blood, it can accept scandal, it can even accept a body carried away by the river's patience. But it resents a design that moves quietly beneath its notice, rearranging ordinary mornings as if they were entries on a page. That was the sensation the ledger left behind. Not panic, but the steady irritation of a lock that refuses the rightful key. The token I had taken from beside the drain felt heavier than its size should allow. In daylight it might have been dismissed as old scrip, the sort of private coin issued by a yard or warehouse, useful only inside a narrow circle. In fog, however, such a thing becomes a language. It says who belongs. It says who may pass. It says who is expected. Under lamplight its face looked nearly smooth, worn by years of handling, yet the center held a faint mark that friction had not fully erased. A hooked shape, almost an anchor, almost a tool. Not official, not ceremonial, practical. The kind of symbol pressed into crates, stenciled onto boards, painted onto doors where men come and go without asking questions. The ledger had taken 2 clerks now, or at least it had claimed 2 spaces where clerks should have been. That could not be coincidence. It was a selection. Men of numbers, men of routine, men whose absence would not cause crowds to gather. Men whose lives could be lifted and carried elsewhere with minimal noise. If the token belonged to a private system, then the ledger belonged to that same system's mind. It did not record events after they happened. It arranged them before they happened. I spent part of the morning doing the dull work I trust most, paper and repetition, directories, shipping notices, lists of firms that lived by the river's traffic. I searched for any hint of an anchor-like device, any sign used often enough to become familiar to those who work the docks. London offers too many possibilities, so I reduced the problem to geography. The alley where the first clerk vanished was not far from warehouses old enough to have cellars and passages that predated modern streets. If someone wanted a man to disappear without witnesses, such buildings would be kinder than open roads. By midday I had a single address that felt less like a guess and more like a pull in the stomach. A storage house set close to service lanes, with thick brick walls and a rear approach too narrow for comfort. I walked past it without pausing, letting my attention slide over it the way an honest passerby's would. From the front it looked like any other working place. Doors, bays, a clerk's window, the ordinary discipline of commerce. It was the side lane that held the same wrongness I had noticed near the alley's grate. The air there carried damp stone and coal smoke, but beneath it a faint bitterness, as if something had been used to make the air cling. The ground dipped toward a drain that ran along the wall, and the lane itself seemed quieter than the streets around it, not by accident, but by arrangement. Sound entered and did not travel. Footsteps lost their edges. I did not linger. Watching too long turns a man into a mark. Instead, I returned to the hinge of the story, the alley. If this was a method, it would be used again. The ledger's calm depended on repetition. A design that works once is tested again, because confidence is built through routine. For an hour the passage remained ordinary, which was almost a relief. People avoided it when they could. A cart blocked part of the wider road, then moved on. The city adjusted as it always does. Yet I kept my eyes on the mouth of the alley, waiting for the smallest shift, fog that thickened too neatly, light that blurred too suddenly, the sense of a curtain being drawn. The shift came without drama. A thin pocket of fog gathered at ground level, dense for no clear reason, and the nearest lamp's halo widened as if the glass had been breathed upon. It was subtle enough to be dismissed as weather. It was also precise enough to feel instructed. A man approached, narrow-shouldered, soberly dressed, moving with the same careful rhythm I had seen the first morning. He did not look about. He did not hesitate in any meaningful way. The alley offered itself like a sensible answer, and he accepted it. The fog received him with an intimacy that was almost gentle. For a moment his hat remained a pale suggestion, then that suggestion dissolved. I counted not because counting would help, but because the ledger had taught me that time mattered. The far end of the alley remained visible, and yet the man did not emerge. When the fog thinned again, it did so as if nothing unusual had occurred. I crossed without running. Running calls eyes, and this method survived on the absence of eyes. Inside the passage the air smelled of damp brick and that same faint chemical edge. The ground showed quick scuffs in the grit, as though heels had changed direction or been guided. Near the low grate in the wall, the grime was disturbed in a small, clean circle. Another token had been pressed there. I stood for a long moment, listening to the ordinary city beyond both ends of the alley. Wheels. Voices. The mild impatience of London moving on. It would be easy in that noise to doubt what I had seen. To tell myself the man must have slipped past me somehow, that the fog had played tricks, that my mind, trained now by the ledger, was inventing structure where none existed. But the neat circle in the grime did not belong to imagination. The token's placement did not belong to chance. And the ledger's dates did not belong to coincidence. I left the alley with a colder certainty than before. The ledger was not merely predicting disappearances. It was scheduling them and paying for them in a private currency that the city pretended not to understand. Section 4. The third column. I carried the second token back through the city as if it were nothing at all. In London, the safest thing a man can do is look as though he belongs to whatever street he happens to be crossing. Suspicion often comes not from the wrong face, but from the wrong manner. Only when my door was closed and the fog was pressed politely against the glass did I lay the two pieces of metal side by side beneath the lamplight. They were the same in size and weight, the same dull tone, the same stubborn refusal to shine. The mark at their center, hooked, almost anchor, almost tool, matched as closely as any stamp can match after years of wear. Yet they were not identical. Along the rim of the newer token, a small notch had been cut, shallow but deliberate, as if someone had wanted to distinguish one permission from another. The private currency, I had thought. Now it looked more like a private numbering system. I made quick rubbings with pencil and paper until the faintest lines rose into something readable. The central mark carried a tiny flaw, an unevenness in the lower curve, that appeared on both tokens, which meant the same die had pressed them, the same hand had ordered them. When I brought them to Blackwood the next morning, he received them with quiet concentration. He weighed them, turned them, and held them near the light until the worn surfaces surrendered their secrets. Then he compared the notch on the second token to the spacing on the copied ledger pages, as if the metal and the ink belonged to one system. The conclusion that formed was colder than anything the fog had offered. The tokens were not merely left behind as signatures. They were being accounted for, one placed, one taken away, one altered for a different stage, as if a transaction required proof at each step. The ledger, then, was not a threat written for fear. It was a schedule written for work. In the afternoon we went, separately and without making a show of it, to the lane beside the storage house I had found. In daylight it looked harmless, built for crates and paperwork. Yet the closer one stood, the more the building insisted on its age. The brickwork was thick and stubborn, raised before modern streets arranged themselves neatly. The ground sloped in a way that suggested older drains beneath, older hollows that polite maps ignore. A painted board near the rear entrance carried a faded device. Most would have read it as decoration meant for men with carts. To me it looked like the token's mark, enlarged and simplified for distance. The same hooked suggestion, the same riverbred confidence. It was not proof, but it was direction. I watched the routine long enough to understand how ordinary it was. A clerk at the window. 2 men carrying a crate with practiced care. A wagon rolling in, empty, and rolling out heavier. Nothing that a passerby could point to and call a crime. But there were misfits in the order. The air near the side wall held that faint chemical edge I had noticed in the alley. A vent set low behind stacked boards breathed intermittently, not with the steady exhale of a cellar, but with short, timed releases. And when the wind shifted, the breath of that vent carried warmth, as if heated air were being pushed up from below. Fog has its own ways, but fog also obeys heat. Warmth rising into cold air will raise a veil quickly, and if that warmth is released at the right moment, in the right narrow place, it can make a pocket of blindness without needing the river to cooperate at all. The thought was uncomfortably practical. Practicality, however, does not remove the human cost. Before evening I walked to the lodging where the second clerk was expected to return. The house was modest and neat, kept tidy in the way people keep a place tidy when tidiness is one of the few defenses they can afford. A kettle sat ready on the hob. A cup had been set aside as if the hand that set it down still believed in habit. On the mantel a small clock ticked with an insistent, almost offended patience. Nothing there had been staged. Everything was simply waiting. I left without offering false certainty, carrying with me the sense that the ledger's calm contained a particular cruelty. It reduced lives to entries, and then treated the removal of those lives as a matter of timing. Outside, the street had its usual sounds again, wheels, footsteps, a distant call, yet even those felt like part of a larger machinery, turning on whether anyone noticed or not. Back at my desk, the copied pages lay open again. I studied them not as a list of victims, but as a set of working instructions. If the disappearances were transactions, then the dates might match other schedules. Shift changes, delivery routes, moments when streets narrowed under routine traffic. Even the neatness of the writing suggested a mind trained to fit people into columns. A ledger always has more than one column. At last I noticed what I had overlooked in my earlier dread. Faint marks beside certain names, almost invisible in the copy, as if the original writer had touched the page with pencil and then erased it. Not every entry carried one. Only some. I compared those entries to the dates and found a rhythm. The marked names tended to fall on days when the river trade was busiest, when carts crowded the streets and a man could be guided into an alley without drawing attention. The unmarked names fell on quieter days, when a different method might be required. 2 methods, the 2 columns of work. As the night deepened, my eyes returned to the next name and the small space beside it where a mark might soon appear. The page was still, and yet it felt as though it were waiting to be updated, like a clock waiting for its hand to move. Outside, the fog gathered again along the street, gentle as ever, hiding the ends of things. And somewhere inside London's ordinary commerce, Men were keeping accounts of disappearances with the calm precision of men balancing books. Section 5. The firm behind the mark. The longer I studied the ledger, the less it felt like a threat and the more it felt like paperwork. That distinction mattered. A threat is written for emotion. Paperwork is written for process. It assumes the world will do what it is told, provided the timing is correct and the instructions are clear. The tokens, laid beside the copied pages, made that assumption almost insulting in its confidence. 2 dull discs of private metal, 2 vanishings carried out without noise, and a city that continued to move as if nothing had been removed from its bones. If the mark at the center of the tokens belonged to a firm, then the firm was the hinge. Not because a name on a door proves guilt, but because names are how systems hold their shape. A private currency must be issued. A schedule must be kept. A ledger must be updated. Even the most careful design leaves traces where it touches routine. So I turned away from fog and brick for a day and pursued the oldest method London offers: paper. It led me through rooms that smelled of dust and ink and damp wool coats, through directories and shipping lists that men consult only when they have lost something and need it officially acknowledged. A clerk's handwriting can be more revealing than a witness, because clerks do not perform innocence. They record. In the directories, the river firms were plentiful, and most wore their identities loudly: anchors, waves, proud heraldry meant to be seen from a distance. The token's mark was different. It was not decorative. It looked like a tool, like a hooked iron meant to pull something heavy. That practical ugliness narrowed the field. I found it in a faded entry in an older list, the kind that lives in drawers long after the ink should have died. The device appeared beside a name that sounded almost ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own warning. The address matched the storage house near the alley. The business was described in the dry language of bonded goods, secured holding, temporary custody. Work that makes men comfortable with locks, inventories, and absence. The entry should have ended there, neatly filed, safely unremarkable. Yet later lists carried small amendments: a change of ownership, a brief suspension after an incident recorded in the smallest possible way, and a shipment discrepancy that drew an inquiry and then, as so often happens in London, no satisfying answer at all. That evening I returned to the lane behind the building at a time when work was slowing and lamps were beginning to take over from daylight. The rear wall held its quietness again, the same sense of sound being swallowed rather than carried. The painted device was there, faint but undeniable once I knew how to read it. I noticed, too, that the paint at the lower edge was newer than the rest, touched up where rain and soot would not naturally demand it. Someone had maintained the symbol. Someone had wanted it readable. Near the low vent, the air shifted in brief breaths. I waited long enough to feel one. Warmth rose for a moment, like a held exhale released on a schedule, and with it came that faint bitterness, sharper now, as if the building were washing its own air before letting it out. Fog obeys heat. Fog can also be persuaded by vapor. The thought arrived without drama, and that was what made it frightening. A pocket of blindness could be made almost anywhere: warm air, treated mist, a narrow passage, a predictable man, a minute of misdirection. Then a token pressed into grime to close the account. Back at my desk, the copied ledger pages looked different. Those faint marks beside certain names were no longer meaningless scratches. They began to resemble method indicators. Days when the city's own fog would be enough. Days when something would need to be manufactured. Days when a different doorway would be required. A professional mind would track such distinctions the way an honest firm tracks whether a crate came by rail or cart. A colder idea followed. If the system belonged to a firm, then the victims might not be chosen for who they were, but for what they could be used for afterward. Clerks. Assistants. Men who handled papers. Men who could be turned into instruments, forced to alter records, confirm shipments, erase traces, or make an account balance when it should not. A disappearance as a means, not an end. Late at night, I examined the second token again and focused on its notch. A distinction. A category. Not wear, not accident. The cut was clean, made by a sharp tool. Someone had altered the token after it was struck, as if the work required the token to change status as the account progressed. The case tightened into something I could finally name. The ledger was not just a list, and the tokens were not just signatures. They were part of a controlled process that touched both paper and brick, both schedules and hidden air. When I traced the next name on the page to its address, my unease sharpened. The target was closer to the storage house than the previous men had been, close enough that the method would not need much help from crowds or long routes. The ledger had moved its focus nearer to the mark, and that suggested the system was growing bolder or growing hungry. It was no longer taking men from the city at large. It was beginning to take them from its own doorstep. Section 6. A door that was not on the map. The next name in the ledger did not frighten me because it was unfamiliar. It frightened me because it was close. The address I traced sat within easy reach of the storage house bearing the hooked mark, near enough that a man could be guided from his ordinary pavement into a side lane without needing a crowd to cover the movement. The ledger had shifted its work inward, tightening the circle. Before dawn I walked the route twice, first alone, then again with the quiet certainty that Edmund Blackwood's attention was nearby even when his figure was not. He had a way of being present without occupying the obvious places. It changed how one looked at corners and windows, how one chose a pace that would not invite notice. The street where the next man lodged was narrow and soot-stained, built for people who lived by routine. Nothing in it suggested danger. That, I was learning, was part of the method. The man appeared at a predictable time, dressed with modest care, a small satchel in hand. He walked with an economy of motion that belonged to clerks and bookkeepers. No wandering glances, no idle stops, a life arranged into straight lines. The ledger had chosen well. We followed at a distance that allowed the fog to soften edges and blur certainty. Yet that morning the fog did not feel like weather. It felt like machinery. At the first turn, the wider street was partially blocked by a cart unloading barrels. Men stood in a knot, shoulders close, voices thick with labor. It was ordinary enough to ignore, but the timing was too neat. The pavement narrowed. A side lane opened on the left, offering a shorter passage past the inconvenience. The man chose the lane. He stepped into the narrower way, and a pocket of fog gathered low and dense, as if a colder breath had been poured onto the stones. The nearest lamp's halo widened. Sound dulled. I moved faster, not running, but letting urgency sharpen my stride. At the mouth of the lane the air carried that faint bitterness again, stronger here, fresh enough to sting at the back of the throat if one breathed too deeply. The fog was not merely thick, it was persuaded. Halfway down, the man's footsteps altered. Not stopped, not scrambled, but changed, as if his path had been redirected by a hand he could not see. The lane bent slightly, then straightened, and at the point where a low grate sat in the wall, the fog deepened until the bricks across from it became a suggestion rather than a surface. When I reached that spot, the man was gone. No shout, no scuffle, no sudden movement for a witness to remember later. Only absence. The lane beyond remained open, and yet it felt like a corridor ending in a blind wall. Blackwood's presence tightened the air behind me, a confirmation that I had not imagined the shift in the fog, nor the bitterness, nor the way sound had been instructed to step aside. He studied the lane for discrepancy, not drama. The great screws were cleaner than the surrounding metal. The soot on the bricks nearby had been disturbed in a narrow arc, as if a shoulder had brushed past. And on the ground there was the faintest clean circle again, the pressure mark of a token pressed down and lifted away. We did not stay. The lane was already beginning to rejoin the city's ordinary sound, and with sound would come eyes and questions. We moved away with the same plainness we had brought. On the far end of the lane, an old woman passed with a basket and did not glance toward us. A boy ran through the thinning fog and laughed at nothing in particular. The city provided its alibis in abundance. Yet the air around the grate held a colder stillness, and when I put my hand near the metal, I felt a faint draft that did not belong to the street. It was the breath of something below. I gathered a pinch of grit from the stones where the circle lay, more out of instinct than certainty. Between my fingers it felt slightly tacky, as if it had been kissed by oil or treated water. The bitterness in the air made better sense of that. A vapor could be carried low, held where walls narrowed the wind, released at the exact minute a predictable man arrived. The fog would do the rest, and any witness would blame weather for what was, in truth, work. In my notebook, I wrote the time of the vanishing to the minute and then, reluctantly, compared it to the ledger's spacing. The intervals were too disciplined to be accidental. The writer did not merely choose days. He chose moments, slots in London's daily machine when attention was busy elsewhere and the street's own movement could be used as cover. If a cart blocked a road, it was not necessarily because someone pushed it there, but because someone knew it would be there and wrote the entry accordingly. When daylight made the fog retreat into corners, we returned with a different purpose. Not to watch, but to measure. The lanes sat between buildings whose foundations were older than the street itself. Near the grate, the mortar line was subtly different, repaired not long ago, and the brick above it carried a slight unevenness, as if a section had been lifted and set back imperfectly. A door that wishes not to be a door still reveals its habits, seams that resist soot, edges that settle a fraction differently after being moved. Blackwood's small instruments appeared as naturally as a handkerchief. A thin blade tested the seam. A small light angled into the gap. What the light found was depth, space behind the brick, and beyond that a narrow passage descending. The smell that rose from it was damp stone and old air, and beneath it the same chemical bitterness, faded now, like the last trace of a perfume after a room has been closed. It was an answer, but not a comfort. A hidden way down meant a hidden way along, and hidden ways in London rarely exist for harmless reasons. They exist because the city is built on layers, and men who desire secrecy learn to live in those layers. We did not go down then. A descent made in haste becomes an error written in blood. Instead, we expanded outward, walking the neighboring streets, noting which yards connected to which warehouses, which drains ran where. The map that formed was not the map printed for honest citizens. It was the map of those who move without being seen. By evening I returned to my desk and opened the copied ledger again. The ink remained calm. The dates remained aligned. But the page no longer felt abstract. Each line now carried a smell, a stone step, a pocket of persuaded fog. And in the margin of my thoughts a third column began to appear, one the ledger did not write openly. Not names, not dates, but locations. Section 7. The map beneath the map. I slept little after we found the seam. Not from fear, exactly, but from the mind's refusal to leave a pattern unfinished once it has begun to show itself. The hidden passage behind the brickwork sat in my thoughts like a door left ajar in a house that ought to be locked. By morning I had accepted a truth that was both useful and unpleasant. The street was only the surface of the case. The work was being done in layers beneath it. London is not one city but many, stacked and stitched together. Older foundations buried under newer ones, forgotten culverts pressed into service again, cellars that once held coal and now hold silence. A man can vanish into those layers without anyone on the pavement seeing more than fog and an ordinary pause at the mouth of an alley. If that was the method, then the case needed a shape beyond names and dates. It needed a third column, locations, access points, chosen with the same calm precision as the ledger's entries. So I returned to paper. Not the ledger's paper, but the city's own. Plans, old maps, insurance diagrams that show basements as carefully as parlors, drainage notes buried in municipal reports. The kind of documents few people read unless a building is collapsing, and yet they contain the truest outline of what London is. Lines appeared that the street never advertised. Service lanes older than they looked. A string of low grates in walls, similar in height and spacing, as if they served something continuous rather than a single cellar. a gentle fall in the ground that suggested a buried channel. When I traced it with my finger, it formed a path running behind facades and beneath pavements, with occasional breathing points where old air could be vented and new air could be pushed down. The alley where the first clerk vanished sat neatly on that line. So did the lane where the third man disappeared, with its disturbed mortar and 2 clean screws. So did the side of the storage house with its brief warm breaths and chemical edge. The realization did not arrive with triumph. It arrived with inevitability. Chance does not arrange itself like this twice, let alone repeatedly. Yet the ledger had done it again and again, and the tokens had been placed like receipts to close each account. When I laid the ledger pages beside the maps, the case tightened into something almost simple: a route below, and a few precise points above where a man could be guided down without a struggle loud enough to travel. If fog could be persuaded at the surface, and air could be controlled below, then the city's most ordinary corners could become doors. That afternoon I walked the district again, but with different eyes. I no longer searched only for the hooked mark. I searched for its habits: paint newer than it should be, soot that failed to settle evenly, vents set low and shadowed, seams that resisted grime because they were being touched and moved. In London, an honest wall collects dirt without preference. A dishonest wall collects dirt with gaps. Near the back of a narrow yard connected, by paperwork at least, to the storage house, I saw one such gap. A short section of brick that looked cleaner than the rest, not scrubbed, but handled. I returned later by a different street and watched from a distance that allowed me to be nothing more than a man waiting for nothing in particular. Work continued. Carts moved in and out. Nothing occurred that a constable could seize upon as proof. But the wall remained wrong, and wrongness that persists in London is rarely accidental. I did not press it. A secret touched too boldly becomes a trap, and this case had been built by men who understood traps. Instead, I carried the detail back to my desk and returned to what I could measure without being seen. The tokens became part of that measurement. The notch on the second piece troubled me because it was not theatrical. It was administrative. It suggested classification, an object altered after use, as if it moved from one state to another: issued, carried, returned, marked. A man who cuts a notch into metal is not improvising. He is keeping accounts. Accounts require a place. The ledger required a place as well: ink, paper, light, time. Somewhere a man could write tomorrow's date with confidence because tomorrow could be managed in advance. By evening the fog began its slow return, polite and familiar, and I found that I no longer regarded it as the main danger. Fog was only the veil. The true danger was the hand that knew when to lift it, when to thicken it, and which corner of the city would obediently become blind for exactly 1 minute. I spread the map out once more and traced the underground line lightly in graphite, linking the known points. My pencil paused at an axis I had circled earlier, close to the storage house, close to where the pattern would most naturally reach next if it continued tightening its circle. Above it, the street was narrow and predictable. Below it, the city's older layer offered silence in abundance. The third column was no longer imaginary. It was taking shape on the page: locations, breathing points, seams that were not meant to be seams. I blew out the lamp and let the darkness settle. Outside, London softened itself in fog again. And beneath it, beneath all of it, I felt, with a certainty that did not require proof, that the system was already preparing its next entry, adjusting its hidden air, aligning its quiet doors, ready to take another name and record it as neatly as any honest firm records a shipment. Only now the line had been seen. And what can be seen, however faintly, can be followed. Section 8. The breathing point. The following day I treated like a page that could not be torn out. I moved through it carefully, leaving as few marks as possible, because the case had begun to feel like a machine that noticed pressure. If we pressed too hard, it would shift. If we arrived too early, it would wait us out. If we arrived too late, it would already have taken what it wanted and left another token to close the account. I carried the map folded inside my coat, not to consult openly, but to keep its line close to my thoughts. A line once seen has a strange effect on the city. Streets that used to feel separate begin to feel like rooms connected by hidden corridors. Service lanes become hinges. Low grates become mouths. Even the gentle slope of a pavement can suggest what lies beneath it. The access point I had circled sat on a street that appeared, in daylight, entirely ordinary. A narrow run of brick buildings, a few shops with modest windows, a public house with a sign faded by soot. The traffic there was the traffic of habit. Men walking to work, women with baskets, carts that creaked in steady complaint. It was not the sort of place that invites careful attention, which was exactly why attention could be used there without being noticed. I walked the street twice without stopping, letting my eyes gather detail the way they always do when I pretend to be uninterested. The first pass gave me the broad truths, where the lamps were placed, where the corners broke sight lines, where a man could stand without looking like a man standing. The second pass gave me the small ones, the patch of mortar that was newer than the bricks around it, the faint scuffing at a doorway that did not match the wear of the step, the shallow groove near the base of a wall where something heavy had been dragged more than once. Near the midpoint of the street, there was a low vent set into the brickwork, darker than the soot should have made it, because the metal was cleaner. It sat close enough to the ground that most people would mistake it for a simple drain cover. Yet when I paused beside it, pretending to read a notice, I felt a thin breath of warmer air rise against my ankle and vanish. It was so brief that it might have been imagined, except that it repeated, not randomly, but with the quiet discipline of a pulse. The city has many pulses. Some are honest, the hours of delivery, the opening of shutters, the passing of trains. Others are private. This one felt private. I returned later, when the day had begun to fade and the street's noise had softened into a more careful rhythm. Fog was not thick that evening, but it did not need to be. The system had proved it could make its own veil, and a thin mist is often easier to persuade than a heavy one. A faint dampness lay in the air, enough to catch lamplight and blur edges. I watched from a position that required no explanation, near a shop window, close to a post, with the posture of someone waiting for a late companion. From there I could see the vent, the doorway beside it, and the turning where the street narrowed into a lane. People passed. A cart rattled by. A man with a tray of bread hurried home. Nothing in it belonged to crime. Then, at a time that would have meant nothing to anyone without the ledger's education, the street's ordinary flow changed by a fraction. A delivery cart stopped too neatly at the corner. Two men paused to adjust a rope, creating a brief narrowing of space. A third man, another figure in sober cloth, a satchel held close, altered his path by a step and drifted nearer the wall. He did not look around. He did not hesitate in a way that would call attention. His movement was small, almost polite, as if he were simply avoiding inconvenience. Yet as he passed the vent, the air at ground level thickened. The lamplight near the bricks lost definition. Sound dulled in a way that did not match the rest of the street. The man's outline softened, and for a moment he seemed to belong to the mist more than to the pavement. His footfall changed once, a short scrape, and then the space beside the wall held only fog and ordinary shadow. The street did not react. It continued to carry its carts and footsteps forward, as though nothing had been removed from it. That, I understood, was the system's greatest protection. Not secrecy, but normality kept steady. When the cart moved on and the rope was tightened and the corner widened again, the mist thinned as if satisfied. The vent breathed once more, warm and brief, and the wall remained a wall for everyone who did not know where to look. I did not approach immediately. A minute too early would have made me a witness. A minute too late would have made me irrelevant. I waited until the street's attention turned elsewhere, until a small cluster of people crossed between me and the vent and broke sight lines naturally. Then I crossed. The bricks near the vent were darker with damp, but one small section of mortar resisted moisture, as if it had been repaired with a mixture that did not drink the air. When I ran my fingers close to it, not touching, I could feel a faint draft at the seam, a colder breath drawn inward after the warmer breath had been pushed out. A place that exhales and inhales on command is not merely ventilating. It is servicing a space that expects occupation. At the base of the wall, the shallow groove I had noticed earlier was fresher than it should have been. In the grit, there were small, sharp marks, as if metal had been set down and lifted carefully. Not a token this time, but something heavier. A hinge pin. A latch. A tool used quickly and returned to a pocket. I stepped back before my body could begin to look like investigation. The street was still quiet enough to punish the wrong kind of stillness. I let my pace carry me away, and only when I had turned 2 corners did I allow my breath to deepen. By then the day's shape had changed in my mind. The ledger's 3rd column, locations, was no longer a theory. It had become a working route with an active door. The disappearances were not merely scheduled, they were serviced, like deliveries made into a private system that ran under London's skin, and that left one question that would not soften no matter how gently I approached it. If men were being taken down through the wall, where were they being kept long enough for a ledger to require tomorrow's dates at all? Section 9. Where the air goes. A city can hide many things, but it cannot hide the movement of air forever. Air is honest in the way water is honest. It follows gaps. It obeys pressure. And when a system begins to rely on controlled mist and timed warmth, it admits, quietly, that there is a space below worth serving. I spent the next morning doing nothing dramatic. No report that could be filed and forgotten. No attention that could be noticed and remembered. I returned to the same mixture of paper and pavement that had brought me this far, because paper reveals intention and pavement reveals opportunity, and the two together reveal the door. The vent on the narrow street had breathed with a pulse. Not a steady leak, not the casual sigh of an old cellar, but a controlled release and draw. That rhythm requires more than cracked brick. It requires a chamber capable of holding pressure, and a passage capable of carrying that pressure away. So I traced the line again, but as an airway rather than a route. Old plans are generous when you can find them. They show the city before it learned to pretend it was simple. They show culverts that were once streams, service corridors built for coal and then ignored, voids beneath warehouses left to keep stone from sweating, voids that can be enlarged by men who prefer their work unseen. One point began to insist on itself. On an older plan, beneath the storage house district, a service tunnel was marked for drainage access, thick-walled, meant to be entered only when something failed. Such tunnels are common enough. What was uncommon was how the line passed close to the breathing points we had already found, and how it widened in one section into a blank rectangle, left unlabeled, as though the draftsman had not been permitted to draw it properly. Blank spaces on official paper rarely stay blank by accident. Blank is safer than wrong. In daylight, I walked the district again and let my pace look aimless. I watched commerce move, crates shifted, shutters lifted, clerks with ink-stained cuffs stepping between doors and desks. The storage house sat among it like a stone that had always been there, neither friendly nor hostile, simply present. My attention stayed with the less visible rhythms. Low vents. Corners where sounds softened too quickly. Spots where brickwork looked tended more recently than the rest. I passed the breathing point street and felt the vent's faint warmth rise and fade against my ankle. Then I widened my circle street by street, watching small things that reveal hidden currents. A scrap of paper that lifted slightly near a drain, steam that drifted sideways instead of up, soot that curved around a seam rather than settling evenly across it. By late afternoon, I narrowed my focus to a yard behind a minor firm linked, by paperwork and habit, to the storage house. It was not the busiest place, which suited a system that valued control over chaos. From the main street, it offered only a locked gate and a sober sign. From the side lane, it offered a wall that looked cleaner than it should have, and a strip of ground at its base where grit had been disturbed in a tidy way. I returned near evening, when dampness hung in the air and lamplight began to soften edges. Routine revealed itself. A cart leaving, another arriving, Two laborers setting down a crate with care that suggested weight, a clerk appearing briefly with a paper and disappearing again. Nothing that looked like crime. Then the yard quieted, not empty, but reduced, as if someone had turned down its volume. I did not approach the wall. I approached the ground. A shallow drain channel led toward a covered opening near the base. I held my hand close without touching and felt the slightest pull, a draft drawn inward. Half a minute later, a thin warmth pushed back out and vanished. The pulse. Weather does not inhale on command. I circled the block and returned from a different direction, because hidden doors are often guarded by watching rather than locks. Only when I was satisfied no attention had arranged itself on me did I crouch again and perform the simplest test I trusted. I held a narrow strip of paper near the edge of the cover. It trembled, not with wind, but with a faint breathing movement, alternating between a delicate push and a delicate pull. So slight a hurried man would never notice. So regular a patient man could count it. A space below was being ventilated. Ventilation implies occupation, even if the occupation is not meant to be comfortable. It implies that air is being refreshed to keep something alive, or to keep something usable, or simply to keep the smell of life from creeping upward into questions. It also implies planning. Someone has considered damp, rot, and the way concealed rooms betray themselves when left to stagnate. I rose, moved away, and left the strip behind in the gutter as if it meant nothing. Then I walked the line on the map in my mind, connecting this yard to the storage house, to the alley grates, to the breathing point street. If the old tunnel existed as the plan suggested, it would run beneath these places like a vein beneath skin, unseen until touched. The question was how to touch it without announcing the touch. That night I laid the copied ledger pages beside the map and read the entries as a timetable rather than a list. If men were being taken down, they were being held long enough for tomorrow's line to matter. That meant the holding place had to be concealed, supplied with air, close to the access points, and stable enough to support repetition. The blank rectangle on the plan began to feel less like an omission and more like a room. I returned to the tokens and imagined them not as curiosities but as counted objects, sorted somewhere in shallow trays, each one representing a completed step. It was an unsettling image not because it was theatrical, but because it was ordinary. Ordinary systems can do extraordinary harm while remaining calm. Near midnight, as the fog began to gather again outside my window, a new certainty settled into place. The case was no longer asking where a man disappeared. It was asking where the disappeared were kept, long enough for the ledger to remain confident. And if London was breathing for them through hidden mouths in brick and gutter, then somewhere below, behind that blank space on the plan, there was a room the city did not admit it owned. A room that held air like a secret. Section 10. The First Descent. Once I had noticed the breathing rhythm, I could no longer pretend it was a curiosity. It was service. It was maintenance. And maintenance, by its nature, repeats. However hidden the room beneath London might be, it still depended on ordinary needs, air, drainage, access. In the end, even secret places belong to the city's physics, and physics has no respect for discretion. I spent the morning preparing myself to look unprepared. Plain coat, dull manner, unhurried pace. Nothing that would make a passerby's glance turn into interest. The map stayed folded and close, never opened in public. The copied ledger pages stayed behind, because paper cannot defend itself if taken. By midday the yard with the breathing cover was active again. Carts came and went. Men lifted, sat down, wiped their hands and moved on. A clerk crossed the yard with the thin authority of ink over muscle. The scene was so ordinary it might have soothed me if I had not known what lay beneath it. I returned near evening and watched from a distance that made me no more than another figure softened by damp air and lamplight. I waited for the yard's quieting, the moment when its noise lowered without fully stopping, as if someone had turned down a valve. It arrived without drama. A cart rolled away, the gate remained closed, and only one man stayed inside, moving with slower purpose before disappearing into the building. Then the pulse beneath the cover changed. Not its existence, but its emphasis. The outward breath lasted a fraction longer. The inward pull followed with steadier insistence. A small adjustment, easy to miss unless one had already learned to listen. It told me what I needed to know. Someone below was preparing the space for use. I did not crouch by the cover. I did not touch it. The wrong kind of stillness is punished on quiet streets. Instead, I moved away in a wide loop and returned to the parallel street where the low grates sat in brick walls. One door is a trap. Two doors are a route. Near one grate, the soot had been disturbed in a narrow arc, recent enough to stand out against the city's stain. The screws were cleaner than their neighbors. The metal looked like an object that had refused to be forgotten. After midnight, I came back. London at that hour lowers its voice. Wheels pass less often, footsteps become singular, lamplight turns to halos in the thin mist. It was the kind of night the system would favor, gentle enough to hide a seam, quiet enough to swallow a small sound. I stood near the grate with the posture of a man fixing his glove and listened. For several minutes there was only the ordinary, distant wheels, a faint call, a loose sign shifting in damp air. Then, beneath it, a different sound arrived, slow, measured movement of air. Not a gust, not a random draft. A controlled working breath behind the wall. I waited for a moment the street would naturally cover. A carriage passing, a corner briefly busy with other movement. In those seconds I lifted the grate. It yielded with less resistance than a neglected object ought to. Darkness opened below, and a colder breath rose to meet the damp street air. It carried wet stone and old soot, and beneath that the faint chemical bitterness I had come to recognize. The opening was narrow, but possible. I lowered myself in careful stages, hands finding stone, feet testing for stability before trusting weight. Above, the city remained softened and forgiving. Below, everything was immediate, close walls, close air, close silence. The tunnel did not run like a sewer. It was too clean for that, too deliberate, built for access rather than waste. The floor was damp but not flooded. Mineral streaks marked old water, but the air moved with discipline, drawn and released as if guided. This was not a forgotten cavity. It was a maintained route. I moved slowly, letting my eyes adjust. In places, faint light fell in thin lines from seams above, more suggestion than illumination. The tunnel widened by inches, then narrowed again, as if altered over time to fit a purpose that had grown more confident. The chemical edge sharpened, not fresh, but stronger, like a room that had been treated repeatedly. Then I saw signs of human handling. A small metal bracket polished by use, a short length of rope cut cleanly and replaced, and on the stone near the floor a faint circle in the grime where something round had been pressed down and lifted away. A token mark, even here. The blank rectangle on my old plans stopped feeling like theory. The controlled breathing had a destination. The tunnel's air was being drawn somewhere with intent. After another turn the wall ahead changed subtly. The stones did not sit quite as naturally as the others. The mortar line resisted stains. The surface held an unevenness that revealed itself only when the faint light glanced across it. A door pretending to be brick. The seam along its base was cleaner than the surrounding stone, not scrubbed, but opened and closed often enough to refuse grime. In that seam the air moved with purpose, drawn inward in a steady pull. I did not touch it. Warmth from a hand lingers. Lingering warmth becomes evidence. I stood back, slowed my breathing, and listened. Behind the false wall there was no conversation, no hurried movement of many feet. Only a low, regular working sound, like a mechanism keeping time. The system's lungs. I stayed long enough to let certainty settle, then withdrew. A descent made in haste can be corrected. A descent made too far cannot. The climb back felt longer, as climbs always do when the mind refuses to loosen its grip. When I emerged again, the fog welcomed me with practiced softness. Lamps floated. The street looked harmless. London offered its ordinary face with easy innocence. Yet my hands carried the cold of tunnel stone, and my thoughts carried the shape of that false wall. The room existed. The ledger had a place to be written. And now that I knew where the air went, the case changed again. Section 11. The token that opens. After the first descent, the street above felt almost too gentle. Fog softened the lamps into halos, and London wore its ordinary face with the ease of long practice. Yet my hands still remembered the tunnel's cold stone, and my mind kept returning to the false wall and its steady inward pull. A hidden door is unsettling enough. A hidden door that breathes with discipline is worse, because it suggests not only concealment, but regular use. In the days that followed, I refused haste. Haste makes noise, and noise is the quickest way to become a story told badly by strangers. Instead, I let the system reveal itself by repetition, the way all systems eventually do. I watched the district at different hours. I counted carts, not because carts were guilty, but because carts move like minutes. I noted when the yard grew busy and when it quieted into that reduced state, as if someone had turned down its volume without turning it off. I measured corners and sightlines, the places where a man could pause without being remembered. Most importantly, I listened for the breathing. I learned to stand near a wall as though reading a notice and to feel the brief warmth at ankle height as if it meant nothing. I learned the rhythm well enough to notice when it shifted. It was not constant. It strengthened at certain points each evening, then eased again, as though the lungs below were being asked to work harder for a time and then allowed to rest. That strengthening suggested preparation. Not response, but readiness. One late afternoon, I saw the hands behind it. A man in a plain coat stepped into the side lane behind the storage house. He did not move like a laborer or a clerk. He moved like someone trained to be forgettable. Average height, average pace, no unnecessary glances. He drifted toward a low vent with quiet certainty, paused just long enough for his hand to vanish into his pocket, and then stepped away. The change below was slight but immediate. The outward warmth lasted longer. The inward pull that followed felt steadier, as if a valve had been opened a fraction. He repeated the act at a second point farther along the lane, and again the breathing adjusted, obedient, controlled. Then he vanished back into ordinary movement as if he had merely taken air. He was not taking anyone in those moments. He was tuning the lungs. That night, with mist thin enough to blur edges but not thick enough to be blamed for everything, I returned to the grate I had used before. I waited until the street offered a moment that belonged to other sounds. Wheels in the distance, footsteps passing, the city arranging its own distractions. Then I lifted the metal with the same unsettling ease. Cold air rose. I lowered myself into the tunnel again, careful and quiet. Below, the route felt less like discovery and more like familiarity, damp stone giving way to drier air as I moved toward the center, the faint chemical edge returning stronger as if I were nearing a treated space. Thin seams of light appeared now and then, just enough to make angles and changes visible without offering comfort. When the false wall came into view, it looked even more convincing than I remembered. The stones sat in patient deception, and the base seam remained cleaner than the surrounding floor, not scrubbed, but used. This time I noticed a detail my earlier caution had missed. A narrow slot cut into the stonework near the seam, precise and neat, half hidden by shadow. The air moved through it with disciplined pull, as if the door itself drew breath. I waited. A footfall arrived behind me, placed with care. Not hurried, not uncertain. A man approaching who did not fear the dark because it belonged to him. I pressed myself into a shallow widening of the tunnel wall and let shadow do its work. He entered the faint light with the same plainness I had seen above ground. In his hand was something small and dull, held with the ease of habit. A token. He did not examine the wall. He did not search for the seam. He knelt, fitted the token into the narrow slot, and turned it with a short, practiced motion. The door answered, not with grinding stone, not with complaint, but with a change in pressure I felt more than heard. The inward pull strengthened for a heartbeat. The low working sound altered pitch as if acknowledging a demand. Then the seam at the base widened by the thickness of a thin blade. His free hand found a hidden grip, and the false wall moved inward with the controlled ease of a well-kept hinge. It opened quietly, because quiet was the entire point. For an instant I saw into the space beyond, warmer light, drier stone, and the suggestion of a table surface catching a dull gleam, like paper or metal laid out under a steady lamp. The air smelled less of earth and more of ink. He stepped through and drew the door closed behind him. The seam tightened. The breathing returned to its regular discipline, as if nothing had happened. I remained still until my pulse steadied. In a place like that, movement is a kind of speech, and speech is how mistakes are made. When I finally withdrew and climbed back into London's softened night, the fog felt less like an enemy and more like a curtain hiding a stage door. The tokens were not merely receipts. They were access. The notch on the second token was no longer an idle distinction. It was function, permission altered as the work progressed. A private currency, yes, but also a private language of doors and stages, issued and marked in a system that valued order above all else. When I returned to my desk, one certainty settled coldly into place. If the wall opened for a token, then everything that followed would depend on whether we could obtain one, without the system noticing that a key had gone missing. Section 12. The Count of Keys. London, above ground, remained polite. The fog softened the lamps, and the streets offered their usual alibis. Wheels in the distance, a door closing, a footstep that arrived and faded as if it belonged to someone else. Yet my hands still remembered the tunnel stone, and my mind kept returning to the false wall and its steady inward pull. A city can tolerate secrets, but it does not like being made to breathe for them. I laid our 2 tokens on my desk and studied them under the lamp. The central mark was the same hook tool, practical and ugly. The notch on the second piece still looked less like wear and more like administration, a cut that belonged to rules. I found myself thinking of the ledger's neat spacing and the careful way the dates sat aligned, as though order itself were the author's religion. In daylight, I returned to the district and collected routine the way a clerk collects figures. The plain-coated man appeared at the same hour and moved through the side lane behind the storage house with quiet competence. He paused at the vents, his hand dipping into his pocket in small, controlled motions. Each time, the breathing below adjusted by a fraction. He was not the mind of the system. He was its attendant, trusted with its lungs and nothing more. When he finished, he vanished through a rear entrance and the door closed behind him with the dull certainty of habit. That door was ordinary, and ordinary doors are the true gateways of secret work. I watched carts and laborers come and go until the pattern of the place settled into my bones. Noise used as cover, routine used as camouflage, and small changes in air used as signals. Near evening the breathing strengthened again, as if the space below was being made ready. Blackwood's own measurements confirmed the hour without needing any sign between us. We returned to the tunnel entrance separately and waited until the district's low vents held their outward breath longer, then drew inward with steadier insistence. I descended. The route carried the same faint chemical edge, stronger now, as if fresh vapor had been pushed through the passages. The false wall waited in patient deception. Its base seemed cleaner than the surrounding grime because it was used. Beside the seam, I noticed again the faint circular stain in the grit where tokens had been pressed down and lifted away, like a ritual performed for the sake of record. I tested one of our found tokens at the slot. It fit neatly and nothing else happened. No change in pressure, no adjustment in the low working sound, no obedient response from the door. The stone remained stone. The disappointment was sharp only for a moment. Then it clarified everything. The tokens we had found were not keys. They were receipts, proof that a step had been completed. The key that opened the wall spoke the same language, but it was a different word, issued for use rather than for closure. If we wanted entry, we needed a token the system considered active. Above ground, the plain-coated man returned near midnight. He checked 2 vents as if confirming settings, then slipped back inside the storage house. The breathing held steady. I watched the rear entrance long enough to see its true rhythm. Laborers in and out, a clerk with paper, then, at a time that felt chosen, the plain-coated man again. This time a flat leather pouch hung from his belt, carried with the unconscious caution of something that mattered. He crossed the yard to a narrow annex whose windows stayed dark even when the main building glowed. The annex looked like storage from the outside, meant for crates, yet the lock on its door shone faintly where other metal dulled. Maintenance leaves its polish. He entered. The yard quieted, not empty, but reduced, as if the system preferred fewer witnesses while it counted itself. Minutes later he emerged without the pouch, checked his pockets by habit, and returned to the main building. The meaning was plain. Tokens were stored, issued, and returned. The annex was not where men were kept. It was where permissions were managed. The system counted its keys like tools at the end of a shift. Counting is both strength and weakness. It keeps order, but it creates expectation. A missing number demands an explanation. So we could not simply take a token. We had to ensure the count still balanced, at least long enough to act. By morning Blackwood had reduced the matter to a practical question of substitution, not daring. A tired hand that prefers routine to scrutiny does not look for perfection. It looks for sameness, weight, dullness, the familiar central mark. What can be a disguise? The older of our found tokens had exactly that quality, age without clarity, a face rubbed smooth enough to discourage close reading. If the annex keeper checked the tray by number rather than by notch, then a substitute might pass for a single night. A single night was all we needed. We returned near dusk and let the city's ordinary movement provide cover. I refused to describe, even to myself, the exact motions that followed. Such descriptions make an act sound simple, and nothing in this case had been simple. It was only quiet. There was a brief moment when the annex door stood open for the plain-coated man, and his attention belonged to the lock rather than the yard. There was a brief moment when the breathing strengthened, as if the system itself exhaled. Then the door closed again, and the yard resumed its ordinary noise. When I stepped back into the street, my pulse felt louder than the traffic. Inside my coat pocket, my fingers closed around a piece of dull metal that was warmer than the tunnel air and faintly scented with the treated bitterness of the passages. This token was different. Its notch was cut deeper than ours, and beside it a second, smaller cut had been made with careful purpose, as if the key itself carried a stage mark. It felt less like money and more like permission made tangible. London continued to look harmless. In my pocket lay access to the breathing door. And on my desk at home, the copied ledger still carried tomorrow's line with calm certainty, as if the system believed it would have no trouble making good on the date. I could not decide which was worse, that confidence, or the knowledge that by morning someone would likely count the tray and discover that one key had been replaced by another. We would have only the hours between those two thoughts. Tonight, the door would either open for us, or it would teach us what the system did to men who tried to read its books from the inside. Section 13. The Room That Kept Accounts. I carried the active token as though it were nothing more than a dull coin in a pocket. The truth of it was sharper than it looked. A piece of metal, warmed by a hidden hand, able to persuade a wall to become a door. We moved without ceremony, because ceremony is memorable. The grate accepted my weight again, and the tunnel received me with its close air and disciplined pull. The treated bitterness in the passage was stronger tonight, fresh enough to sting faintly at the back of the throat, as if the lungs below had been primed in advance. Preparation, I understood, was confidence. The system expected to be used. The false wall waited exactly as before, patient stone, convincing mortar, a seam at the base cleaner than its surroundings because it refused to be allowed to settle. I fitted the token into the narrow slot and turned it slowly. Speed makes noise, even when stone pretends otherwise. The response came through the air first. The inward pull strengthened for a heartbeat, and the tunnel's low working sound altered pitch as if acknowledging the demand. the seam widened by the thickness of a thin blade. A hidden grip presented itself without my needing to search. The wall moved inward on a hinge kept in better health than any honest hinge deserves. It did not scrape. It did not complain. It opened with controlled ease, as if silence were its pride. Warmth met my face from within, dry warmth, carrying the smell of ink and metal rather than damp stone. The light inside was steady and low. I stepped through carefully, and the door closed behind me with the same quiet discipline that had opened it. The room was smaller than dread would have built, and that made it worse. Large secrets belong to melodrama. Small secrets belong to businesses. A table stood near the center under a shaded lamp that pointed its light downward with practical purpose. On the table lay paper in neat stacks, some blank, some filled with the same measured hand as the copied pages. Beside the stacks sat a ledger, open, its columns ruled with calm certainty. Along one wall, shallow trays held tokens in rows, each dulled like the ones I had found, each marked in small ways, different notches, tiny cuts, slight variations that meant nothing to an honest eye and everything to a mind that counted stages. A strip of cloth lay beside them for wiping, and above them a simple rack held tools, a small file, a punch, a short blade. In one corner, the mechanism worked steadily, the source of the low sound in the tunnel. Pipes ran into the wall, joints sealed carefully. The system's lungs were not improvised. They were maintained. Pinned beside the table was a hand-drawn map. Streets above, a darker network below. Tunnels, grates, vents, seams. Points numbered as if they were stations of work. Next to it, a schedule in plain notes. Cart at corner, gate closed, yard quiet. Besides several entries, initials, small marks to confirm tasks completed. The ledger lay open to a page where tomorrow already had its place. The date sat aligned, calm and certain. Beneath it, a name waited, and beside it a faint pencil symbol, light, erasable, and yet authoritative. A method mark, as I had suspected. A choice of door. A choice of fog. I leaned close enough to read without casting my shadow too far. The names were not all clerks, though many were men of invoices and signatures. Others were listed as foreman, agent, porter. The pattern was not spectacle. It was leverage. Remove a man, return him long enough to sign what must be signed, to correct what must be corrected, to make an account balance that should not balance. Gaps created by disappearances could be filled by whoever held the timetable. A faint sound touched the tunnel beyond the door, a careful footfall, placed with routine. The room did not react like a place expecting intrusion. It reacted like a place expecting work. I did not take the ledger. A missing ledger would be a scream. Instead, I took what would be missed last. A single sheet from the top of a stack, blank on one side, ruled on the other, stamped faintly with the hooked mark in the corner. A form prepared for entries yet to be made. Proof that this room belonged to a process, not a story. I slid the sheet inside my coat where it would lie flat and silent. Then I returned the token to its slot and turned it back with the same slow care. The seam tightened. The air's pull returned to its steady discipline. The wall settled into deception as if it had never moved. I withdrew into the tunnel and let darkness take me again. Behind the false wall, the footfall continued, nearer, paired with a faint clink of metal that suggested tokens being handled, counted, sorted. The system was checking itself, and the thought tightened my throat. If the tray was counted before morning, the substitution in the annex would be discovered. If the key was logged tonight, its absence would not remain invisible for long. When I emerged into London's damp night, the fog felt thinner, not because it had changed, but because my mind had. The case was no longer rumor carried by mist. It had weight, paper under my coat, ink on a page, a map pinned inside a hidden room, and a ledger that treated men as entries to be moved at will. Tomorrow still waited on that page, confident, aligned, prepared. Now the only question was what a system like this did when someone tried to audit it from the inside. Section 14. The night before the entry. I did not sleep and I did not pretend to. My mind kept returning to the same small facts, turning them over with a clerk's stubbornness. The stamped sheet on my desk, the numbered points on the hidden map, the trays of tokens sorted like tools, and the ledger page where tomorrow waited already aligned. What unsettled me was not the existence of the room beneath London. It was its calm. The shaded lamp, the ruled columns, the file and punch within easy reach. It felt like late work, not sudden violence. Men who build such rooms fear disorder more than conscience, and their first instinct is not to flee. It is to count. By morning, someone would count the tray. Our substitution might pass for an hour or two, depending on how much the attendant trusted habit over scrutiny. But habit, once disturbed, wakes suspicion. If the active token was issued and expected back, its absence would shine inside that system like a missing line in a book. That gave us a narrow advantage, time measured in hours, not days. The stamped sheet meant little on its own, but it was enough to tie the hooked mark to real paper and real work. Proof, however, does not stop a timetable. The ledger would still attempt its next entry, because systems continue until something breaks them. The obvious temptation was to return underground and tear the operation apart. Take the ledger, pull down the map, scatter tokens like spilled coin. But a missing ledger would be a scream. A scream invites chaos, and chaos is how the guilty become only another shadow in the fog. In London, the quieter method is often the only one that holds. The lungs were the simplest truth. Without controlled air, the pockets of persuaded mist would fail. Without the mist, the surface doors would lose their minute of blindness. Without that minute, disappearances would stop being tidy transactions and start becoming risks. Yet to strike too early would also announce us. The ledger's method mark was pencil, not ink, adjustable. The system chose its door based on conditions. If we forced conditions to change, the door might change with them. So the night became an exercise in restraint. I walked the district as though I belonged to it, letting damp air soften edges and dull certainty. Shutters lowered. Lamps took over. The yard quieted into its reduced state as it always did, and beneath it the breathing strengthened, outward warmth held longer, inward pull steadier. Whatever had been disturbed by the substitution had not yet reached the point of reaction. After midnight I went down again, not to open the false wall, but to listen. The tunnel's low working sound held steady. The treated bitterness was stronger, as if the lungs had been primed for use. At the door seemed the air pulled inward with disciplined insistence, and that was enough. I turned back before the tunnel could become my habit. Habits are noticed. Above ground, I watched the annex. The plain-coated attendant appeared near the hour I had learned. He entered, later emerged, and his hand touched his coat twice in a way that suggested reassurance followed by doubt. A small crack in routine. The count was coming, perhaps not at dawn, but soon enough that we could not afford another night of hesitation. So I returned to my desk and wrote the next hours as if scheduling a print run. The street, the access, the breathing point, the time the yard quieted, the minute the lungs strengthened. I compared that to the ledger's alignment and accepted what the pattern implied. Tomorrow's entry would be attempted as planned. The system believed itself more reliable than any man's fear, which meant it would bring its own method to the surface. That was where we would meet it, not in its hidden room, where it held every advantage, but at the moment it tried to take another name and turn it into a line of ink. If the method required a pocket of mist, we would watch the mist. If it required a convenient obstruction, we would watch what blocked the road. If it required a token pressed down like punctuation, we would watch the ground. I held the active token once more and felt its dull weight in my palm. Permission made tangible. Stolen permission, which always demands repayment. Outside, London softened itself again in fog. Above ground, the city prepared to repeat its honest routines. Below ground, a different routine prepared to claim another man as an entry, neat and aligned. Tomorrow would decide whether the ledger remained a book the city obeyed, or whether it would be forced, at last, to balance its accounts in daylight. Section 15. The ledger balanced. Morning came thin and gray, as if London wished to show its truest color before the lamps were allowed to soften it again. The fog had not gone. It only waited at corners and low places, patient as habit. The name for that day moved through the city in the manner the ledger preferred. A sober coat, a satchel held close, steps that did not wander. Routine was his armor, and predictability his blindfold. He was not important to London's imagination. He was important to the page. We kept ourselves unremarkable, letting the street do what it always did, carry men forward and forget their faces. We chose corners where sight lines broke, places where one could pause without being remembered. The city's noise and movement had protected the system before. That same noise and movement protected us now. The obstruction arrived as expected. A cart stopped where the way narrowed, ropes adjusted with needless care, a small inconvenience that made the side lane feel sensible. It might have been coincidence, if I had not seen coincidence repeated with such discipline. At the same moment, the air near the wall thickened at ankle height. Not in the honest manner of weather, but in the precise manner of a valve. The clerk altered his path by a single polite step, drifting nearer the bricks and the low vent that pretended to be only a vent. The pocket of mist began to gather, late, imperfectly. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though the veil could not decide whether to form. That hesitation was the first true crack I had ever witnessed in the method. The breathing beneath the street faltered, only slightly, only for an instant, yet it disturbed the little cloud the system depended upon. The fog did not settle cleanly. Sound did not soften as fully. The lane did not become blind. The clerk slowed, feeling the wrongness without knowing its cause. A passerby glanced toward the wall. Another paused to let the cart pass. Attention, which the system normally borrowed without payment, began to return to the street itself. A plain-coated attendant approached the vent with the quiet certainty of a man tending machinery. When the mist refused to behave, he corrected his position with a quick step, and in that quickness he betrayed the very thing he relied upon, invisibility. He became, for 2 or 3 seconds, a man doing work in a place where no honest work was being done. Then the moment passed. The clerk continued on, stiff-backed, intact in the world. The cart moved, the ropes settled, and the street resumed its ordinary rhythm. But the day's entry had not been taken. The ledger's confidence had missed a beat. I did not imagine the system would surrender because it had been inconvenienced. Systems retreat to their strongest layer, and this one's strongest layer was below. By late afternoon, when lamps began to take over and dampness returned to the air, the breathing strengthened again in preparation. We went down by the grate, and the tunnel received us with its close air and its disciplined pull. The low working sound held steady, as if the mechanism below could not imagine being audited. At the false wall I used the active token. It slid into the slot as if returning home. The pressure changed. The seam widened. The door opened inward with the same controlled silence that had made it so difficult to prove. Warmth met my face, dry and ink-scented. The room was exactly as I remembered. The shaded lamp, the stacks of paper, the trays of tokens sorted like tools. The map on the wall stared back at me with its numbered points, a diagram of London treated as an instrument. The ledger lay open, calm as ever, with a line prepared for tomorrow as if tomorrow belonged to whoever held the key. I moved only as far as I needed. I took no unnecessary objects. I gathered what would speak loudly without needing me to speak, the stamped forms, the schedule notes with their confirming marks, and a small bundle of pages from the ledger that showed names, dates, and method symbols in the same measured hand. Evidence is a strange thing. It is often just paper, and yet it can change who a city believes. Beyond a more ordinary interior door, the hidden space confirmed what the lungs had already implied. Men were being kept alive, not for drama, but for use, held long enough to be made compliant, returned to the surface long enough to sign what must be signed, then taken down again until the account was settled. The ledger was not counting endings. It was counting leverage. The room reacted to disturbance in the way a business reacts, not in the way a nightmare reacts. Tokens were shifted, papers straightened, tools reached for as if order could be restored by quicker hands. The system did what it had always done, tried to make itself tidy again. But tidiness cannot survive daylight once the doors are known. Heavy footfalls arrived in the tunnel, more than one, and with them the unmistakable presence of official purpose, men who measure wrongdoing rather than balance books. The false wall, so proud of its silence, was forced to open for the wrong kind of attention. Lamps that did not belong to the system spilled light across the trays and tools. The numbered map was unpinned. The ledger was lifted, its aligned dates transformed from authority into accusation. Those taken from the streets were brought back into air that belonged to London again. Their first breaths sounded loud in the tunnel, because freedom always makes noise at first. Above ground, they blinked at the fog as if it were a rumor, and at the lamps as if they had forgotten the language of evening. By the time the street had fully darkened, the district had changed its shape. Doors that once opened quietly were being watched openly. Corners that once hid work were being examined. The system's greatest protection, normality, had been turned against it, because normality does not tolerate being used forever without noticing. I returned to my desk late, and the stamped sheet no longer felt like a fragile secret. It was only one piece among many, and that was the point. A single clue can be denied. A stack of ordinary papers, all pointing in the same direction, is harder to dismiss. Outside my window, London softened itself again. The fog moved where it wished, and the lamps kept their patient halos. Yet something essential had changed, and it was as simple as breath. The city was breathing for itself again. Now, as you let this night drift away from your mind, you can leave those tunnels where they belong, beneath stone, beneath paperwork, beneath histories that do not need to follow you into sleep. And if you'd like to return for the next quiet case, you can support the channel by liking this story, subscribing, and leaving a calm comment below, so you don't miss the next mystery in Edmund Blackwood's London.